December 20th, 1943. The winter air above northern Germany was a frozen battlefield, thin, brittle, and laced with smoke from hundreds of exploding shells. Below the clouds, the industrial city of Bremen burned, its factories twisted in flame. Above it, the sky was a storm of silver, American bombers in tight formation, pushing through waves of German flak. Among them was one aircraft that would make a home. Its name, painted in chipped white letters across the nose, was the Old Pub. The pilot, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, just 21, sat hunched at the controls of his B-17 Flying Fortress. It was his first combat mission. He'd studied everything about aerial warfare, formation flying, engine management, emergency drills, but none of that training prepared him for the sight of his bomber tearing apart around him. The flak burst first, tearing open the nose, shredding the oxygen lines, sending frost into cabin. The top turret gunner slumped, blood pooling near his feet. 2 engines were gone, another coughing black smoke. Bullets chewed through the tail, the radio compartment, the wings. Inside, the intercom hissed static in prayer. Brown's co-pilot leaned over, shouting to the roar wind. "We can't make it. We've got to bail." But Brown refused. His hands clutched the yoke, like he was holding on to life itself. Below him, the flat white fields of Germany looked endless, but somewhere beyond them, there was England, home. His crew, 9 men wounded, freezing, terrified, looked to him for an answer. His voice came back through the static. "We're staying together. Hold on." Moments later, the horizon filled with enemy fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, sleek and predatory, closing fast. The bomber was limping, helpless, an easy kill. One after another, the fighters struck. Holes bloomed across the fuselage, the rear gonna stop firing. Inside, men screamed and fell silent. Brown's mind flickered between fear and fury. Try and keep the engines alive just long enough to reach the North Sea. Then silence. The fighters peeled away, leaving the Old Pub somehow still flying, more skeleton than aircraft. But as the bomber drifted, another shape appeared in the distance. A lone Messerschmitt, climbing toward them. In the German cockpit, Franz Stigler, a decorated Luftwaffe ace, squinted through his canopy. The American bomber ahead of him was torn to pieces. A miracle it was even in the air. His orders were clear: destroy enemy aircraft. But as he closed in for the kill, something stopped him cold. Through the shattered tail section, he could see inside the bomber the faces of young men slumped at their guns, bloodied and broken. One was tending to another, pressing a rag against his wound. Stigler had seen plenty of death, but never anything like this. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was execution. He remembered the words of his former commander, Gustav Rodel. "You are a fighter pilot, Franz, not a murderer." Instead of firing, Stigler eased his throttle and pulled alongside the bomber, just meters away. Charlie Brown froze. Through the cockpit window, he saw the enemy pilot's face, calm, focused, strangely compassionate. For a few seconds, neither man moved. Then Stigler pointed downward, signaling. Land, Sweden, safety. Brown shook his head. He didn't understand. Or maybe he didn't trust it. He turned his plane west. Stigler, realizing they were heading for the North Sea, stayed with them, escorting, not attacking. The 2 planes, enemies locked in silent agreement, flew together over the German countryside. Farmers on the ground gawked at the impossible sight. A German fighter protecting an American bomber. At the edge of German airspace, Stigler gave a final salute, a small, precise gesture of respect, then rolled his fighter away. Brown watched him disappear into the gray sky and whispered to himself, "Good luck, friend." Minutes later, the Old Pub crossed into the North Sea. Its engines wheezed, oil dripping, wings trembling. Somehow, Brown coaxed it back to England. The landing was rough, the crew half dead, the plane barely intact. Mechanics who saw it later said it was a wonder it hadn't fallen apart midair. When intelligence officers debriefed the crew, they listened politely, until Brown mentioned the German fighter that spared them. The room went still. "A German fighter escorted you home?" one officer asked. "Lieutenant, are you aware of how that sounds?" Brown insisted. He drew out on paper, described the pilot's eyes, the silver aircraft, the salute. But no one believed him. The report was filed away, quietly stamped confidential, and never spoken of again. For Charlie Brown, the war continued, mission after mission, target after target. Yet that one moment, that strange mercy in the sky, lingered in his thoughts like a ghost. Every time he took off afterward, he wondered if the man who spared him was still alive, or if fate had already balanced the scales somewhere above the clouds. In Germany, Franz Stigler also kept his silence. He told no one what he'd done, not even his squadron. To admit sparing the enemy could mean court-martial or worse. That night, he made a quiet note in his logbook. Be 17 heavily damaged. Did not fire. Nothing more. 2 pilots, enemies by war but bound by conscience, returned to their sides of the world. Neither would forget the other, though decades would pass before the sky would bring them together again. The guns finally went silent in 1945, but for Charlie Brown, peace arrived like a noise he couldn't quite recognize. The roar of engines was gone, the vibration in his hands, the constant hum of danger, all of it replaced by the unsettling stillness of survival. He returned home to West Virginia with medals and memories. Though he rarely mentioned the latter, the war had taken much from him, friends, innocence, sleep. But it had also given him one impossible image he could never erase, a German pilot, saluting him in mercy. At first, he did what so many veterans did. He buried it, joined the diplomatic corps, wore suits instead of uniforms, smiled at dinner tables when people said, "You must have seen some things." But sometimes in the middle of calm conversation, his eyes would drift upward, searching the ceiling like it might open into sky. He wondered what had become of man in that Messerschmitt, whether he'd survived the war, or if the same code of mercy that saved Brown's life had cost Stigler his own. In Germany, Franz Stigler lived through a different kind of silence, one filled with guilt, ruin, and memory. The Luftwaffe was gone, the cities were rubble, and his nation's pride lay in ashes. He flew no more. His family's home in Bavaria had been destroyed. The skies he once ruled were now patrolled by others. In the post-war years, he worked as a mechanic, then an immigrant, finally settling in Vancouver, Canada. But he carried with him the same ghost Charlie did, the image of that battered B-17 and the young pilot inside who refused to give up. Time went on. The Cold War began. New enemies replaced old ones. Jet aircraft replaced the piston engines of the past, and the world seemed to forget the fragile, smoky skies of the 1940s. But somewhere inside, Brown couldn't let go of that day over Bremen. By the late 1980s, long retired and living quietly in Florida, he decided to find the man who had spared him. Not out of curiosity, but gratitude. He began writing letters to veteran groups, aviation clubs, and military archives. For months, there was nothing but silence. Then one day, in 1990, a letter arrived from Canada. The handwriting was careful, elegant, German. It began with 5 simple words. "Dear Charlie, I was the one." When they finally met in a small living room in Vancouver, both men were in their 70s. But when they saw each other, something ancient broke open. Not just memory, but recognition. They embraced like brothers, separated by time instead of blood. Reporters who later documented the meeting said the two laughed, cried, and sat in silence for long stretches, just looking at each other. 2 old soldiers trying to understand how one brief moment in the sky had shaped their entire lives. Charlie told him, "Franz, I owe you everything." Stigler replied softly, "No, Charlie, you owe me nothing. I could never have shot you down. You were a man trying to get home." Their reunion became something more than personal. It became symbolic, a living artifact of humanity in war. Veterans across the world heard their story and wept. Pilots retold it to their cadets. The U.S. Air Force and the German Air Force both honored them jointly, a gesture unthinkable during the war itself. They began touring together, speaking not about combat, but about compassion. In front of young aviators, Brown would often say, he could have ended 9 lives that day, and no one would have blamed him. But he didn't. And because of that, I learned there's something higher than duty, it's decency. In training manuals, instructors began referencing the Brown-Stigler incident as a case study in moral courage, the moment when a soldier's humanity triumphed over instinct and orders. No formal rule was written, but among pilots, a quiet phrase began to circulate. Remember the German who didn't shoot. Their friendship lasted for nearly 2 decades. They visited each other often, celebrated birthdays, and even spent Christmases together. When one spoke at veteran gatherings, the other sat nearby, smiling like an old wingman. Their families said they became inseparable, 2 souls bound by the same sky. When Charlie Brown passed away in 2008, his friend Franz was there, standing in uniform at the funeral. The flags that covered the coffin, American and German, fluttered together in the wind. Someone nearby whispered, "That's the man who spared him." Stigler simply nodded. Later that same year, Franz Stigler followed his friend into history. In his home, among his medals and flight logs, his family found a photograph of the B-17-year-old pub, its tail number carefully circled. On the back, in his neat handwriting, he had written just 6 words: "My friend, my enemy, my brother." The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became more than a wartime anecdote. It became a parable for the modern pilot. Their encounter reshaped how future generations thought about the line between enemy and human, between duty and conscience. It reminded aviators and everyone who heard it that mercy is not weakness, but the highest form of strength. Even now, in air bases across the world, their story is still told, not as legend but as truth. Pilots training for missions in aircraft far more advanced than anything from 1943 still hear about the day a German fighter refused to fire and an American pilot refused to crash. Every time an airman salute before takeoff, there is, somewhere in that gesture, a quiet echo of Franz Stigler's hand rising beside a shattered B-17, a salute that crossed nations, enemies, and decades. And so, high above the noise of history, their story endures, proof that even in the darkest clouds of war, 2 men can still find the courage to see each other not as enemies, but as equals under the same endless sky.